I think because of the late time, I will forego the pages and pages of interesting information I have on all of our speakers today and simply refer you to the write-ups that you have in your program on each one of them. We have 4 members to our panel. John Hager, who is Special Counsel to Eckert Siemens. Ian Duncan, Program Director for Earth and Environmental Systems, Bureau of Economic Geology, University of Texas at Austin. Robert Jackson, Nichols Chair for Global Environmental Change, Duke University, and a Rice graduate. And Richard Dixon, Executive Director, Center for Applied Business Research in Energy and the Environment, Alberta School of Business, University of Alberta. We have made a slight change in the order, and Richard Jackson will go second after John Hager, who I introduced to you now, and please welcome him.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for still having some interest in this topic at this relatively late hour of the day. I have a presentation which I am going to go through, but before I get into the details of the environmental challenges and to some extent some of the opportunities associated with shale gas development, I want to talk very quickly about compared to what. One of my pet peeves of all of the discussions around energy issues generally and shale gas specifically is that because of time constraints and often and sometimes for other reasons, it's a discussion that is stovepiped, and you never make the point about, well, if not gas, what else would be happening? And I think it's very, very important before we get into the real environmental issues associated with shale gas development to remember, and I think I could defend this rather strong statement I'm about to make, that the impacts in production of natural gas and combustion of natural gas on its very worst day is not as bad as the impacts from the production of coal and the combustion of coal on its very best day. And oil, I think, would probably fit into you could say the same thing about it. I think it's also important to understand, and now I'll refer a little bit to Pennsylvania, that there are significant water quality issues in Pennsylvania, but shale gas has impacted water minimally in the state, and I will get into the details of that in a moment. The key word there was minimally. But shale gas impacts or natural gas drilling impacts on the quality of water in Pennsylvania wouldn't even reach the top 5 and probably not the top 10 threats or damages to water in Pennsylvania. It pales in comparison, for example, to acid mine drainage or agricultural runoff, or I'm afraid to say raw sewage pouring into our rivers and streams on days of heavy rain because of our old combined sewer systems, and I could go on. Without further ado, we'll now get into the details of some of the issues associated with development of shale gas. I have composed a list of 10. This is a somewhat arbitrary list, but I want to quickly go through them. One of the very first concerns that you often hear, and this was true in Pennsylvania when shale gas development really started, and that basically was 2008. By the end of 2008, we had 200 shale gas wells drilled in Pennsylvania. The very first concern is water withdrawal. And the public has a sense that there's a huge amount of water being used in shale gas development. And in one respect, they're right. There are a lot of water trucks on the road carrying water from a source to shale wells. And each well is around 5 million gallons, give or take. But in a comparative sense, again, they're wrong. The shale gas drilling in Pennsylvania consumes less than 0.5% of all of the water withdrawn on a daily basis. It ranks 10th out of the top 10 uses. It's quantities in the millions, whereas power production, for example, on a daily basis is withdrawing billions. of gallons. The issue of water withdrawal, however, did in fact cause a problem for two streams. A gas drilling company put the equivalent of a big straw in a small glass and damaged two streams early on in 2008, and we took regulatory action, which I'll mention later, to deal with this. So at least in Pennsylvania, which is a water-rich state, in fact, our problem is too much often. We have floods as opposed to too little. With any kind of reasonable commitment by operators and reasonable regulatory oversight, it's not a problem in Pennsylvania, and I would say that's true of the whole Marcellus. There are big differences, I understand, in Texas and Eagle Ford. Water resources are at the other end of that, probably extreme. Water disposal is an issue that I think has received a great deal of attention, and appropriately so. The drilling wastewater is indeed highly polluted. The New York Times spread on the front page of its Sunday paper on February 27th the assertion or the fear that it was radioactive and that indeed Pennsylvania's water, drinking water, might be contaminated with radioactive or radionuclides as a result of poor handling of water disposal. There's been an enormous amount of work done in the Marcellus, and certainly in Pennsylvania, around reuse and recycling. Now, at least 70% of the water in Pennsylvania is in fact reused or recycled. There are treatment options in Pennsylvania. There's a company, for example, called Eureka that can take drilling wastewater and more or less turn it into distilled water. It's open for business. It has a very good business right now. This is not a company or a treatment project that is on the drawing boards. It's literally taking drilling wastewater today, and it's been doing it for a couple of years. And then there's deep well injection. And certainly deep well injection has been a major means of disposing of drilling wastewater. Not really in Pennsylvania itself. There's only six or seven deep well injection sites in Pennsylvania, but a significant amount of that water has been trucked to West Virginia and Ohio, and the recent events in Youngstown has also, of course, created a new concern, and that is seismic activity associated with deep well injection. I think it's fair to say that when a homeowner or a resident feels a 4.0 earthquake, and the people in the Youngstown area felt an earthquake, there's an environmental impact. Now, I think it's also critical to point out that it's not, quote unquote, because of hydraulic fracturing per se. This was not because fracking was going on in the neighborhood. It's associated, and I think it's pretty well accepted, that deep well injection sites, regardless of the source of the liquid, can induce seismicity. Often the earthquakes have been very, very small, meaning 2 on the Richter scale, but 4 can and was felt, and that needs to be taken seriously. And the Ohio regulators certainly have done that. They've closed that site, and by the way, before they closed that site, they had placed monitors in the site because there had been other much smaller earthquakes before the 4.0, and they had put in seismic monitors, and they were able to get a lot of data, which led them to close that site. Arkansas has also had a regulatory closure associated with deep well injections. Gas migration. This also, I think, is a real issue. It's an issue, however, that tends to be misunderstood and to some extent denied by some in the industry, by no means all in the industry, and exaggerated by some in the environmental community, though, again, by no means all. In our experience in Pennsylvania, there have been a small number of private water wells that have, in fact, been contaminated as a result of gas migrating because of poor drilling practices. Dimick is well known. There's been a big argument between the regulatory officials in Pennsylvania, and I was the former secretary and the company involved I will point out that there was no pre-gas drilling testing done of the wells, and as a result, a lot of significant inspections and testing of the gas intermix was done. Certain water wells were found to have been contaminated as a result of gas migrating from gas drilling, and some other water wells were found not to have been so contaminated, but to have had pre-existing gas or biogenic gas. There's another case that has received less attention in Pennsylvania, involving the same company in the same county in Lenox Township, where there was pre-gas drilling testing done, and the pre-gas drilling test showed essentially no methane in the water. And the Department of Environmental Protection has cited the same company for gas migration because now, at least in the case of one water well, there are concentrations of methane that are in fact dangerous, potentially explosive. So in that case, you had pre-drilling water testing demonstrating no pre-existing methane, and then lo and behold, after drilling, there's a significant amount of methane in that particular water well. The Pavilion study, I think, bears a little comment. I think it's important to note here that the EPA has stated that the geology of this circumstance and the drilling of this in this area is unique. It's their own words. They point out that the drilling was done in an aquifer, and the fracking occurred very close to the aquifer, very little distance between the fracking zone and the aquifer, matters of hundreds of feet as opposed to thousands of feet. They also point out there is no cap rock in that area. They have further found that one source of the groundwater contamination was pits, and apparently the company involved, Ancana, doesn't actually contest that some of the pits have been operated in a manner that has led to groundwater contamination. There's considerable still disagreement over whether hydraulic fracking itself caused contamination. I think that the EPA has in fact behaved responsibly in this area so far. I think the only way to handle this highly charged issue is publicly and transparently. They've done a study now for 3 years, including drilling a couple wells. They've made available a draft, and they keep on saying it's a draft report. They've provided for a public comment period. They're providing for a peer review study. I'm not sure, were they to essentially close off comment or proceed in a more secretive manner, whether their work would be as useful as it, I think, can be as they go through the full process. It is a draft report, and there are clearly parts of that report that may well change, and including the bottom line. But there are things in that report beyond the pits that are troubling to me. The description of some of the drilling practices in that report, if true, I think should trouble anybody, whether in the industry or not, including drilling through the aquifer, at least in 2 cases, according to the EPA report, with no casing and no cementing. Now, that's in the report, and I don't think anyone in the industry should or would defend such a practice if, in fact, it was true. I think there's every reason to believe it was true, or is true. We'll see when we get to the final report. There's also Professor Jackson has the Duke University study. I'm going to let him comment on that. If there's time, we can talk some more and question and answer. There is also a Penn State University study that actually reached rather different conclusions from Professor Jackson's study. They looked at 200 water wells and found no correlation between the presence of drilling and the presence of methane in water wells. Methane leakage is another, I think, legitimate issue for discussion, though I think it too has been probably exaggerated to some extent by certainly Professor Howarth and some others, and also to some extent dismissed by some in the industry as unimportant. There is a whole range of papers now that seem to flatly contradict the Howarth study, the first Cornell study, including what I call the Cornell second paper, which is a commentary that was just published by 4 professors at Cornell that pretty much, I'll use the phrase, took Howarth to the woodshed for a series of what they would call errors in his paper. But I think it's really important that all of us take this issue seriously. The brand for natural gas is clean heavily depends on the fact that natural gas, in fact, produces less carbon than coal. And if that is not true, or if it is diminished in some way because there's a great deal of venting or other methane leakage, you're damaging the natural gas brand, I think in a very serious way that can have big implications for natural gas going forward. Now, why isn't this moving? I'm pressing try the keyboard. Okay. No, it went too far. Classic. All right, public lands. Interest of time, I'm not going to dwell on this, but there's I think appropriately amongst the public, a belief that private lands and public lands are different, and that what private landowners do with their property should, by and large, decide the question, consistent perhaps with zoning and other necessary regulation. But public lands, at least in Pennsylvania, state forests and state parks are viewed completely differently. And in Pennsylvania, we have had drilling on state forests for a long time, and we have leased for Marcellus shale development. Approximately 1/3 of the state forest total acreage has been leased at some point in its history for gas drilling, roughly 700,000 acres out of 2.2 million acres. Truck traffic is another major issue that the public consistently raises. The Pennsylvania State Police and the Department of Environmental Protection have been doing random road stops of truck traffic associated with gas drilling. And at least through 2011, the truck stops were leading to some pretty unfortunate results. As many as 40% of the trucks stopped involved in gas drilling were put out of service by the state police for safety problems. That's a very real number. It's a number coming from the Pennsylvania State Police, and I don't think it's one that can be dismissed, and it needs to be wrestled with by the industry, every company in the industry. Road damage, spills, and emissions are other issues associated with truck traffic. Air emissions, it would be the 8th issue, and I tend to believe that there's been an exaggeration of the problems associated with gas drilling on water and an understatement or too little attention with the air emissions questions. Certainly in Wyoming, concentrated drilling led to very, very bad air, real smog that would cause human sickness, could even cause people to lose their lives. The air quality was as smoggy and as dirty as, I won't use Houston as an example, I'll say LA on a very bad day. I could have said Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. We too have some of our problems in Pennsylvania. But it was really, really bad air. And it was in a part of the country where the air previously had been very good. Now, were that to happen in Pennsylvania or in the Northeast, and there is a significant amount of emissions already there, were gas drilling to cause that kind of deterioration of air quality in our region, the quote-unquote blowback effect of that occurrence would be enormous, and in my view, appropriately enormous. It is something that this industry and regulators have a responsibility to prevent from occurring. Accidents, spills, and leaks. This has probably got the industry as much bad publicity as quote-unquote DMIC, and perhaps you can include DMIC in this category of accidents, spills, and leaks. Bottom line is every company in the industry needs a culture of safety. There are some companies that take this very, very seriously. There are over 80 companies in Pennsylvania with a drilling permit, and I don't think if I were asked by anybody in this audience, do all 80 companies have an excellent safety record and a true culture of safety? You would believe me if I stood here and said yes. At least I hope you wouldn't believe me if I said that. The answer is there's a real variation. There's real differences in culture within these companies, and that variation is a problem for the industry. The industry has a real need to have a culture of safety built. I think it can do it partially by itself, but frankly, this is where regulators need to play a significant role. I know how I drive when the state police are right around the corner. I drive a little bit better. My culture of safety goes up if I know I'm going to be watched. And I think that's just human nature, and I don't think any company, even the most motivated on this question, would differ with that. Indeed, the companies most motivated on this question should, and I think typically do, welcome a significant regulatory presence. Groundwater contamination. We've talked about Pavilion. Let me simply say, I think the major issue with groundwater contamination is surface spills, as opposed to hydraulic fracturing itself causing contamination of aquifers. It may be the case that Pavilion is the first really confirmed instance, we'll see, where hydraulic fracturing caused an aquifer to be contaminated. If it is, it's obviously an extraordinarily rare event. And we've been fracking for a long time. If it was causing a lot of such events, we would have many more confirmed examples than Pavilion. However, leaks from pits, leaks from spills, or spills at the surface have indeed caused problems, and that's where our focus ought to be in terms of protecting groundwater. Last, to wrap this up quickly, there is a real need to address these issues, not simply through the good work of responsible companies, but through regulation, to assure the public that the environmental issues are being addressed. And that was the case in Pennsylvania. There is a water plan requirement now that has a very protective standard for withdrawing water. There is a new water disposal regulation, and it is probably the case that in Pennsylvania, there's less drilling wastewater being discharged to rivers and streams than prior to the first Marcellus well. The standards are so much higher and the enforcement is so much stronger that the industry is, in fact, having a lower footprint on rivers and streams than prior to the very first Marcellus well. And that's one of the results of all of this focus on the water disposal issue. There's also been a very significant effort to strengthen the drilling regulations. I think that's important. The words on the page matter, but execution matters too. And that's back to this issue of culture of safety. You can have the strongest rules and the strongest enforcement, but if in fact companies are not equipped day in and day out, minute by minute, to take excellence seriously, then execution is going to trump even the best rules and produce poor results. There is mandatory disclosure of chemicals in Pennsylvania. That rule became final in February 2011. You know what's happened in Colorado, Texas. There are many states that have moved forward in this area. By the way, the list of chemicals in the case of Pennsylvania has been on the DEP website since 2008. There's a rule requiring a 150-foot buffer for our high-quality streams from all development. This is not a gas drilling rule specifically. This regulates Dunkin' Donuts, residential developments as well. And that's a quarter of our streams. We've also raised the fee for drilling, raised it to between $5,000 and $10,000. It had been $100 and never raised since it was first set in the 80s. All of that funds were used to, in fact, increase staffing. You can't have a responsible industry, in my view, without a world-class regulatory body. And if staffing isn't adequate, you don't have a world-class regulatory body. States who want to regulate this and insist the federal government should stay out of their business have a responsibility, first and foremost, to make sure their staffing is appropriate. We hired in 2009, 2010, and we more than doubled the staff. To my knowledge, Pennsylvania is the only state to do that. We went from 88 to 202. So I think staffing is a very significant issue. It's certainly one the public gets, and it's certainly one the public, at least in Pennsylvania and the Northeast, is focused on. And then enforcement. The state police in Pennsylvania stop trucks and put them out of service. When you're driving improperly, you're going to get a ticket. In Pennsylvania, the drilling enforcement staff has been active. They've issued 1,200 violations in 2010, 1,100 violations in 2011. These violations range from relatively quote-unquote small to very serious. It has been the philosophy at DEP that small things lead to big problems. So it's important to, in fact, identify problems early. And I think the industry gets a lot of credit here. Most of these violations, the vast majority of them, have not been contested by the industry. The appeal rate on these violations is very, very small. Probably less than 1% of the violations issued have been appealed. And I think that is a good thing. I think that's a sign that the industry, in fact, wants to take problems seriously and fix problems before they get perhaps even bigger. Last but not least, I think this story is the heart of why natural gas has a good brand. And if it wants to keep a good brand, this emissions profile has to remain true. And it also has to be something that the industry itself talks about. I don't believe the industry does a good job in explaining this or stating this. There seems to be a reticence. And I think some in the industry still deny global warming and climate change, and I think some of the environmental groups now are to the point where they're not willing to stand up publicly and say that the environmental footprint of gas is less than oil and coal. That's a tragedy. Those two statements are a big problem. This is why gas is important to the environment of the US and the world. Gas is obviously hugely important to the consumer, saving $1,000 in my state a year for a typical family. That's a big, big deal. It's important economically. But this message, this air and health benefits of gas generation, just hasn't been driven through the public mind and the public pulse. And I think that's primarily the responsibility of the gas industry to do that. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for staying. It's a pleasure to be back in Houston, where I grew up. For the most part, to be back at Rice, where I was an engineer, and also my first job with the Dow Chemical Company. I spent time down in Brazosport, so Texas is my home away from home, if you will. I'd like to talk about shale gas and its environmental footprint, acknowledging some coworkers, Abner Vengosh at Duke, Stephen Osborne, a former postdoc in my lab, Nat Warner, a grad student, and some other folks I'll acknowledge along the way. John gave a nice overview of some of the issues. I want to make 3 points in our brief time today. The first point is that, in my opinion, based on the evidence so far, that the environmental risks associated with shale gas extraction are manageable when done properly. So that's, if you remember one thing, that's the first thing, perhaps the only thing to remember. The second point is, I think sometimes companies, those of you who are actually doing the hard work of getting the energy out of the ground, do yourselves a disservice by fighting tooth and nail the acknowledgement that there are environmental consequences associated with shale gas extraction, rather than saying there have been problems that have come up, where do they occur, why do they occur, and why don't they occur in many other places. And then the third point would be to make a suggestion, I guess, or to challenge those of you in industry to band together. I've stated this publicly a couple of times, to take the best companies and say, these are the improvements that we're going to make for shale gas extraction. These are the measuring, the monitoring, like John Deutsch talked about this morning, and get some credit for doing that and banding together as an industry. It might be 10 out of those 80 companies that John talked about, if you will. But you can get some credit by proactively doing what you're doing, but doing it together, do it publicly. If I could have the slides on the screen, that would help. They're beautiful slides. I'm looking at them. Is there any, there you go. Diverse views, to put it mildly. Brian Walsh's Time magazine cover from a year ago. The kinds of signs that people talked about in the last section, don't ruin my water. The proximity of drilling in the Marcellus, in this case, to that house, a 250-foot setback in Pennsylvania. And ultimately, even with the science, the most interesting part of this project for me are people and the stories that they tell. So I've walked up hundreds of driveways and talked to the people in each house. Most of those people are pretty happy with the way they've been treated, happy with the economic returns they've gotten if they've signed a lease. But there are other people who are bitterly unhappy with how things have gone, or disenchanted in some way, or somewhere in between. Again, I think the question is to understand why people have different experiences, and to act on those and to minimize those negative experiences. So people have different views, just like researchers and companies have different views. I want to talk a little bit about the stray gas work in our study, on other things, looking at fracturing fluids and brines. The first paper came out in May that some of you know. That included between 60 and 70 homes. We asked a simple question, and that was, was people's drinking water any different if you lived near a natural gas well versus farther away? We focused on private water wells because those are people without a municipal water source, without regular testing, and without the safeguards that those of you on a municipal water source enjoy. So nobody tests their water unless they pay for it. All right, so we've now visited more than 200 private water wells in that area. We've concentrated on northeastern Pennsylvania because that's the area where drilling has been the fastest, as Art showed earlier this afternoon. That's a picture of Nat Warner in the lower right. That's just some simple measurements we make in the field, but most of the work is done back in the laboratory, looking at brines, potentially radioactive, naturally occurring radioactive materials, methane, ethane gas concentrations, and isotopes. So I don't drill for a living, but I do environmental chemistry for a living. And my colleague Avner Vengosh does as well. So we do light organic isotopes. We do geochemical isotopes, strontium, boron, radionuclides, brine geochemistry. This is what we do for a living, and then gas work. Now, our first paper, when it came out, said that we found no evidence for produced waters or brines that are found naturally in Marcellus. For what we looked for in terms of fracking chemicals, we found no evidence or no change for people's drinking water. That's a good news story. This is a graph of follow-up work we've done since then. Just a general characterization. That conclusion holds for the next couple hundred houses. We don't see any relationship in brine concentrations with distance to wells. We are able now to look for more constituents in fracturing fluids than we did initially. But same story holds in this study that's not published yet, but that has been submitted. We do find some relationships with where homes are, and this is a point that made in a recent paper, the Oil and Gas Journal by Malofsky et al. In valley bottoms, we tend to see areas where it does look like there's connections between Marcellus-like brine and people's shallow drinking water, more fractured environments. Not related to gas drilling, but that occurs naturally. That bears directly on issues such as barium contamination that has been claimed associated with hydraulic fracturing, for instance. So we have to understand the baseline, the background, and the geology behind that background to be able to determine or say something about when gas drilling or some other operation might affect those things. So in terms of brines, fracturing fluids, we don't find them associated with people's drinking water. What we did find, and what we've continued to find since then, is a relationship between how near you were to a gas well and the concentration of methane and ethane and other things. That's what you're looking at here. The y-axis is methane concentration, milligrams of methane per liter. The x-axis, the horizontal axis, is distance to the gas well in meters. So particularly below about 1,000 meters or 1 kilometer, about 2/3 of a mile, you're more likely to have very high concentrations of methane in your water. The gray band is the Department of Interior recommended action level or area of concern. Anything above that 28 point is what they recommend for immediate action. So those points above that, in some cases, are dangerously high. Okay, what does this mean? And it doesn't mean. Well, it means to me that, in my opinion, based on the data, there's something going on with relationship between how near you are to a well and concentrations of gases, not just for methane. It does not mean that everybody within a kilometer is going to have a problem with their water. Not true. It does not mean that most people within a kilometer of the water are going to have a problem. But we need to understand why the problem cases occur. And we could spend, and I have spent many, many days talking about, came up this morning about issues, random sampling, pre-drilling, everything that I'm happy to have that conversation. But there's something going on here. And what I've argued is that shouldn't have been a surprise. Right, this is a DEP report from John's time, I believe. These are stray gas events, if you will. Every push pin is an event, most of them in the last 5 to 10 years, of gas intrusion into water. There's a lot of those push pins. So the notion that stray gas is some kind of a surprise or doesn't exist really, I think, is counterproductive. The question is, where does it occur and what's the mechanism? In our case, we've never said that the mechanism was a direct movement attributable to hydraulic fracturing, that fissures were opening 5,000 feet and that gas was traveling to the surface. That's not the simplest explanation. The simplest explanation is that in some cases, some companies get in a hurry, and the wells and the casings, in particular the cement, is not done to the level that it should. That's where I would start. That's a relatively easy problem to fix. Right, Pennsylvania's doing some of that. They improved their well construction and cementing recommendations in February of this year. In June of this year, they proposed overhauling the Oil and Gas Act again. We had recommended, for instance, when our paper came out, a 3,000-foot presumptive liability rule instead of 1,000 feet. They recommended 2,500 feet. So Pennsylvania has taken steps to improve this. Let's see how this plays out. Okay, then there are cases like this. Okay, these are the kinds of calls and emails and photos that I get now. And so again, this is not normal, but this stuff happens. Now, how would you like that to be your water? All right, now that water may not be risky. That could be sediment, could be all kinds of things. But you think, all right, what's in there? Does it come and go? Is there something in my water, even when my water's clear, that I don't see? So part of the issue here isn't just the chemicals or what's in the water, it's the uncertainty associated with these kinds of cases. And that's what's disconcerting to people. So in this brief period, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about other issues. They asked me to talk about environmental issues in general. John talked about stray gas and the greenhouse gas footprint for methane. Here's some work that we've been doing trying to address some of the error bars associated with how much methane leaks into the atmosphere, from production all the way to the stove, like at my house. So imagine, if you will, this is work with Nathan Phillips of Boston University, I should say. Imagine a Google Street View approach to methane leaks in the city of Boston. So you put a real-time instrument, new technology into your car, high-resolution GPS unit, and you drive every street in the city, 10, 15 miles an hour. And when you get a plume of natural gas, you hop out, you grab a sample, you take it back to the laboratory and analyze its isotopic composition and concentration to look and see, is it sewer gas, is it landfill gas, does it look more like natural gas? So when you do that, here are a few pictures. You've got the unit in the car. It's in the trunk. John Carr, who runs my mass spec labs, on the lower left. You get a few cases like the lower right. We're pulled off to the side of the road. We've got our flashers on. Policeman pulls up. I think, oh, great. Here it comes. He walks up and says, "May I help you?" And I said, "Well, we're here sampling natural gas, and there's a leak here. We can smell a mercaptan in the air." And he stands there for a minute, and he says, "I am so glad you came. I've gotten calls about this place for 2 years. When someone smells gas, they call us, they call the fire department. We have to go out there and do something about it, and there's really nothing that we can do about it." All right, so this is the approach that we've taken in Boston, just as a test case. Boston has old infrastructure, a lot of piping, 50, 7,500 years old. This is the kind of map that you get. So these are plumes 10. We found up to sort of 20 or 30 parts per million. These don't tell you leak rates. These are concentrations. So we're using other approaches to try and integrate this at the city basis to see how many homes this might represent in total gas. But this is pretty useful information. You can see where the leaks are. You can do something about them, try and prioritize them, and maybe save a few lives too. So this is going on now, done essentially for the whole city of Boston. There are, depending on how you define a leak, over 3,000 leaks through the city. So this gets at trying to reduce the error bars, and ultimately to try and reduce the error bars in terms of how much methane gets to the atmosphere. Ultimately, you're trying to reduce the amount of methane that reaches the atmosphere so that you can make natural gas even cleaner. Some additional public concerns that come up. John talked about air quality interactions. These are very real. When you look in the cases of Wyoming, Colorado, Texas to some extent, really you're just starting to hear this in the Marcellus region where we've been working. Water for hydraulic fracturing, 3 million gallons per well, for instance. I live in a relatively water-rich area in North Carolina. Pennsylvania is a relatively water-rich area. There are cases where if you pull a bunch of water out of a stream or river that's over-allocated or small, you can cause problems. But that's not the first thing on the list I would worry about, unless perhaps you're in the Eagle Ford or out west, as came up earlier, when groundwater pumping or things are used to generate the water that goes into this. The disposal of produced waters is a more substantive issue in my view, whether it be the high salinity in the Marcellus. The Marcellus does not represent all of the plays in the country, of course. There's higher radioactivity naturally occurring, low level but radioactivity, but that can build up at the surface in water treatment facilities and things. Arsenic, barium, I already talked about, bromide, that can cause trihalomethane. Earthquakes have already come up. Again, not the issue that I would spend most of my time on, but disconcerting again. And if there ever happens that you get a 5 or a 6 earthquake that coincides nearby with the well, then how are you going to tell whether that had anything to do with the well itself if the epicenter is not 500 feet away, as it was with the tremors in the UK for the Quadria case? So these are things that, these are sort of a list, if you will, but not all of these, in my view, have the same level of concern. Management of produced water is something that John talked about. The options are narrowing as some wells close. Pennsylvania has a voluntary moratorium on surface treatment at municipal facilities. Some states allow you to spray on lands to dispose of that produced water. Not a good idea, in my opinion, because of the high salinity involved. Municipal water treatment, private water treatments, what's the fate of that water and the salts after going to a private treatment facility? Is it disposed into surface waters? And then, of course, the best development promoted by industry currently is reuse and recycling of that water to fracture the next well. So that's a development that everybody wins. So finally, coming to a theater near me, the state of North Carolina has no oil and gas commercial production at all. We have no wells, but we have shale gas, not nearly the reserves that you have in the Marcellus and other large plays around the country. But we have ours. So 6 months or so ago, I, along with Stephen, wrote an op-ed in the Raleigh and Charlotte papers, said essentially, how are pigs and drilling rigs alike? The analogy I used was that we had tens of millions of hogs on the ground in North Carolina before anybody thought that it might actually affect our air and our water quality. And that legacy essentially took a lot of years for the rules, the monitoring, and best practices to come into play that now make that industry much better. So in the case of North Carolina, we've made some simple recommendations. There's nothing exotic here, especially in a state like Texas, where you have such a long history of development. But just simple things about zoning and setbacks, particularly planning for water withdrawals and wastewater disposal. Deep injection is illegal in the state of North Carolina currently, as is hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, which are under discussion in our legislature. Make sure fees cover long-term costs for monitoring, things like that. And we have no oil and gas lawyers in the state of North Carolina, so it's hard for homeowners to get good information about this if they want it. Finally, and I'll close with this point, when I'm teaching a class on energies I do now, energy and the environment, I always get students to talk about energy broadly. So when I get on a plane to fly from North Carolina to Philadelphia or to Pittsburgh or to Binghamton, when we're going to work in the Marcellus, I fly over countless mountaintop mining sites, for instance. So it's counterproductive, I think, to view shale gas in isolation. We have to view it across a spectrum of how we get energy. Our goal from the very beginning has been to try and understand where the problems occur, to minimize those problems, and to make this production as safe as possible. Thank you very much. I should also add, because we're running so far behind, I was supposed to leave after the conference was over, but I'm now leaving towards the end of our panel, so my sincere apologies about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate being invited to talk today about the environmental impact of shale gas. And I'm going to first show some photographs, which I think What I derive from these photographs is that if I was a propagandist, I would find shale gas a pretty easy target, just from the image point of view. However, we need to focus on facts and not on images. I want to look at two main issues: water well contamination and atmospheric emissions. And I'm going to first show you some quotes from various protagonists in this argument. Because more than a war of facts, this has been a war of words. So what do the opponents say about contamination of groundwater? Well, here's some words by Professor Howarth, the David R. Atkinson Professor of Ecology and Environmental Biology at Cornell University. And this was in a formal written submission to the EPA in 2010. He said, shale gas development clearly has the potential to contaminate surficial groundwater with methane, as shown by the large number of incidences of explosions, contaminated wells in Pennsylvania, Wyoming, and Ohio in recent years. The fact that there is no shale gas in Wyoming and Ohio, I guess, doesn't make much difference. Well, anyhow, I think that sentence wasn't strong enough, so in the next paragraph he said, shale gas development has clearly contaminated groundwater and drinking water wells with methane. And this is spread to the EU. Here's a white paper from the Tyndale Centre at the University of Newcastle in the UK. It says there's considerable anecdotal evidence from the US that contamination of both ground and surface water has occurred in a range of cases. And there's been more recently a report to the EU Parliament that details this in incredible detail. And I was a little unnerved that last year I gave a talk at a UT Law School event in Houston, which was like energy for lawyers. You know, my talk was called Shale Gas 101, and it ended up being referenced in this EU report to the EU Parliament, which I found rather unnerving. But I'm easily unnerved, I guess. So what does industry say? How does industry respond to these charges? Well, here's something from Rex Tillerson, the chairman of ExxonMobil, in congressional testimony in 2010. There have been over 1 million wells hydraulically fractured in the history of the industry, not one reported case of freshwater aquifer ever having been contaminated from hydraulic fracturing. And he actually added in his testament, comma, not one. Now, this kind of statement is fairly typical of industry leaders. The national gas groups and so on have come out with this, it's never happened. And if you look at the facts, these statements are true if you look at various caveats in there. For example, you would have to say there's been no documented examples of contamination from the actual down the hole 5,000 feet beneath the surface fracturing event. There have been examples of contamination from drilling prior to fracturing, things happening in the surface, the top part of the well after fracturing. There's been at least one well that auto-fractured itself into an aquifer, and another 2 examples where this may have happened. And in all these cases, pollution, contamination did get out into water wells. Now, these weren't associated with shale gas, and they weren't associating with the fracturing per se, so these statements are correct if you put enough caveats on them. And of course, if we're in Houston, we have to see what Professor Economides thinks over at the University of Houston. And he thinks the hydraulic fracturing process is safe, already well regulated, and that there's been a hysterical outcry which is completely unjustified. And I guess he felt that wasn't good enough, so he also said that what the most of the arguments made by environmentalists were, quote, huge lies, and that their concerns were preposterous. All of which might be true, I guess. My point is that it's really hard to move forward when we have two sides that are at such extreme ends of things. It's also hard to move forward when the focus is being put on issues that in some cases are not very important. For example, there's a woman called Amy Moll at the National Resources Defense Council who has a blog, who keeps a running total of water well contaminations. I think she's up to something like 35 or 36 cases of contamination. And she announces that anybody who feels their well has been contaminated should just send it in and she'll post it. Well, this list has found its way over to the European Parliament. It's found its way into all sorts of congressional hearings. I've gone through each one of these cases, and with one exception, I've gone and I've tracked down the water analyses, the chemical analyses of the wells where such a thing exists and available, and looked at it. And in every case, the chemical analysis of the water well, when you compare it with water analyses for wells in that county or that part of the state, in Texas, in Oklahoma, in Wyoming, in Pennsylvania, and Colorado, is within the spectrum of water analyses that you find in water wells in that part of the country. So basically, people are complaining about, I don't like my water. So what's going on here? Well, most people don't have a clue what's in their water. They're not interested in their water well. I used to live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Virginia Tech sent around this little pamphlet and said, if you would like your water well tested, come to the local school next week, bring a sample, and we'll test the water for you. We'll take it off and test it. Out of my little neighborhood of 28 houses, I was the only one who went. Most people didn't want to know what was in their water, had no interest in it. However, somebody comes and drills a well near your house, and you go, oh my God, my water might be contaminated. Let's have an analysis. Boy, it's got arsenic in it. It's got iron. It's got manganese. Pennsylvania in particular has some of the worst water wells in the country, because they have basically no regulations on how to build a water well and so on. So there's lots of issues. And this focus on people's complaints about water, though I think is driven more about people's complaints about the noise, the inconvenience, the view sheds of having drilling, but the water is something they can grab onto. I lived for 10 years with my own water well. Every time we had somebody come and work on our water well would turn black and sandy and look like some of these containers you see in these photographs. Why? Because the casing of our well would get banged, all sorts of biofilms and rust and stuff would get stirred up, and our water would be crappy for weeks afterwards. Unfortunately, I didn't have any gas company that I could sue for $1 million to compensate me for this inconvenience. But anyhow, so what do we really know about groundwater contamination associated with shale gas exploration? Well, the answer is not very much. Groundwater saturated in methane is in a significant number of water wells overlaying the Marcellus Shale and the Barnett Shale. This has probably been there since time immemorial. There are photographs of 10-foot flames shooting out of water wells being drilled above the Barnett Shale 15, 20 years ago, long before gas shale drilling got into the area. There were pamphlets going back decades in Pennsylvania, which was what to do if you have methane in your water well. And the pinpoints that the previous speaker showed on the map of Pennsylvania, a lot of them went back 10 years before shale gas drilling began. So methane is very widespread and has been widespread. The USGS did a random sample, and I think random sampling is important, of water wells in West Virginia. About 5-8 years before there were any shale gas drilling, they found that 20% of the water wells they sampled were contaminated with methane, and about 10% were essentially up to the saturation level. And I think this is, the data we've seen since then shows that that's pretty common in Pennsylvania and in areas overlying the Marcellus. Gas accumulations have led to explosions and have been leading to explosions in areas above the Marcellus for decades. And there probably is something, some connection between gas drilling and methane forming bubbles and accumulating in explosive amounts. But I'm not at all convinced it's something to do with the fracking or the well cement. It may be tied up with pressure waves affecting these supersaturated methane waters. I think there's a lot that we need to learn about those yet. So anyhow, that's already been talked about, the Duke study, so I won't go on. So there's been 70 stray gas incidents documented by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection over the last 20 years, and a number of gas explosions. So this is something that's endemic to the area. So conclusions. The causation of groundwater contamination by shale gas activity has not been demonstrated, in my opinion. And I think there are other interpretations that can explain a lot of the observations. The focus on implausible water well contamination issues has diverted attention from real issues that require attention. What I mean by implausible water well contaminations is charges that there's arsenic in my well, charges that there's iron and magnesium in my well caused by the fracking, because these kind of chemistries are typical of water wells nowhere near the fracturing. So people's complaints about bleeding gums, their hair falling out, their cats dying, which have been recorded in a lot of these blogs, just divert our attention from what the real issues might be. I even think that the Pavilion, Wyoming thing, if I was the EPA and I was looking, I had so many millions of dollars that I could spend to look into groundwater contamination related to hydraulic fracturing, Pavilion, Wyoming would be one of the last places I would go to look, because there's nothing much at stake there. There's no water resources. The reason that people get methane in their wells there is they're drilling these hugely deep wells down into gas reservoirs trying to find water, because there's so little water there. So I think this whole listening to public complaints has distorted our approach. So what about atmospheric emissions? Well, Professor House is always ready with a quote, and he said, "Widespread air pollution with compounds such as the carcinogen benzene is prevalent in both Texas and Pennsylvania." Now, unlike the groundwater contamination, there actually is some evidence here that we can look at. There's been extensive studies, and we can actually evaluate this statement. There's no doubt that compressor stations, that fugitive leaks from wells and pipelines and from gas processing plants do create emissions of all the things that we don't want to have in the air, which the EPA calls things like VOx and HAPs, lots of volatile organic chemicals and HAPs, hazardous, I forget what it is anyhow, they're bad stuff. But do these cause dangerous emissions? Well, here's some 24-hour samples around various gas plants and compressors in the Barnett Shale area, done by Titan Engineering, who was hired by some of the gas companies, I believe. And we actually see that there are some places where there are benzene numbers that are up above the long-term levels set by TCQ as being safe. So there are some issues. There have been other studies where they've gone and surrounded the plants, and there are values that are definitely of concern right in around the plants. When you look away from the plants, these values dissipate just because of air turbulence and so on. One of the biggest problems that they discovered around gas processing, compressor sites, is a chemical called formaldehyde. That's a chemical that you've probably heard of before, and it probably wouldn't be too much of a stretch to believe it's bad stuff. And one gas company president said, "I don't believe that we don't have formaldehyde in my gas." Well, it turns out that formaldehyde is created in the exhaust of the compressors. And there have been levels measured around plants that give concern. If you use electric compressors around cities, you can avoid this. So there's been considerable effort to try and track the plumes of benzene around these plants. And in general, with a few localized exceptions, there are not huge spikes in benzene. Now, I apologize for this slide, it's a little difficult to read. That's parts per billion going from 0 up to 0.35 on the vertical axis, and the year 2000 through to 2010 along the horizontal axis. And this is benzene values for the Dallas-Fort Worth area from various monitoring stations that TCQ runs. Now, what you see here is that the benzene values have been going down somewhat steadily over the last 10 years. Now, what this is about is that most of the benzene in Houston and in Dallas is caused by automobile traffic and is caused by emissions from gas stations. This information is being used by industry to say, see, there's no problem. But it's probable that the decline would have been even greater if there hadn't been the Barnett Shale. And we know, for example, that when you get out to the west side of Dallas, that emissions from shale gas are making up about half of it. You probably can't see it there, but that green dot, well, the blue triangle is Dish, that you might have heard of. It's a very famous little town. And about somewhere between 40 and 60% of the benzene in the atmosphere in Dish is probably coming from shale gas. If there was no shale gas there, the emissions would be down near where the green dot is, probably. So, I think that Professor Howarth's argument can't be sustained. One of the issues in this world is that in benzene in particular, the main pollutant of benzene are ourselves. If we smoke, we probably get 5 or 10 times as much benzene as anybody living in Dish. If we live in the middle of a city like Houston, then we're getting twice what there is in Dish. So, conclusions. Widespread air pollution by benzene is not caused by shale gas activity. Local elevated emissions are a concern, but could be remediated. And in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Barnett Shale is contributing to the emissions, but the program that the EPA is running to lower emissions of benzene and other ozone-related things is being successful and is sort of swamping out whatever trend we might see. So where does that leave us? Well, I thought this was an interesting quote from a recent law review article. It said the fracking industry should prepare to be blamed for a myriad of environmental problems until scientists and geologists are better able to define and evaluate the risks and the extent of contamination caused by fracking fluids. Unfortunately, there's very little funding for universities to work on these problems because the Department of Energy has basically cut, or Congress cut, all oil and gas related research. And on that note, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Baker Institute and Amy and the opportunity also, like Jim Carter, to get out of the cold. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta. Head up the Center of Applied Business. Let's see if we get this thing working here. There we go. Applied Business Research, Energy and the Environment. Also teaching in the business school, Energy Economics. With Amy's permission, of course, this is being live streamed, and the Canadian media are picking up on this. And the reason is that I've been asked to comment, and part of my role and responsibility at the University of Alberta is to comment on public issues. And so if you could bear with me, I'm going to combine that, a statement that I need to make with our presentation, and hopefully I can meld the two together. Okay. This afternoon, President Obama of the United States announced the denial of the permission for the Keystone XL pipeline to TransCanada on the basis of a health and safety of American people, as well as concern for the environment. So as Canadians, what does this mean to us? 3 important wake-up calls. First wake-up call to our politicians, particularly our Premier, Alison Redford, is that in uncertain economic times, the myth has been that jobs will always trump environment. Not the case. If one thinks that this will be a one-off event, one from our own research around the green wave technology, certainly, and green wave occurrence, and whoops, that it is an important aspect to understand that that's not going to be the case. In other words, this could happen again. More on that later. Second wake-up call is to the engineering community. In Alberta, we have been very fortunate that most of our companies are run by engineers with a very strong entrepreneurial spirit and have done so with great credibility, integrity, but they approach these issues today still with an engineer mentality. Okay, the world's changed. No longer is it going to be simply engineers running companies from that perspective, but it is going to be social scientists, the MBAs, and others who come and bring a different thought and different perspective to the issues. And so the wake-up call is to realize that the issue around Keystone XL was not an engineering issue. It was a social license issue, and so needed to be approached from a very different perspective. The third wake-up call, in general, for Canadians in particular, is that the U.S. does not need our oil. This is a world oil market that we live in. They can buy the oil from other places. It doesn't have to come from Canada. And so the resolve, I would expect to see that there will be very much a Canadian crystallization of resolve to look for other markets and other opportunities outside of the relationship that we have with the U.S. Certainly that will continue. It will be a good relationship, but we will certainly see a much greater resolve, and we'll certainly hear more of that in the next days and weeks ahead. Having said that, let's take a little trip up to Fort McMurray. The oil sands, and delightfully the two Jims that came earlier with Jim Carter, Jim Mulva, and I deeply appreciate them talking about the oil sands, and they covered most of my presentation. So that's a good feeling, and so we'll just touch on a few basic points. The size of the trucks, if you've never been up there, quite something. And the whole point here is looking at the resource, just to put it in a different perspective. 8 times the current U.S. reserves, 4.5 times what USA peak. The idea that we've got 1.8 trillion barrels of oil in reserve, and we've talked about that a little earlier. There's been mention about the amount of investment. So from an investment point of view, and the numbers here are a little different, but one of the reasons that the Angos target us is because we've got half the money, investment money, coming from international oil companies. So the Shells, the Syncrudes, Suncors invest heavily, and we've got half of their world investment at our doorstep. And we're getting more from the national oil companies. Recently announced that China is buying into the oil sands and has extended their play into our market and into where we are. The production capabilities, that's already been talked about, so I won't touch on that anymore. The challenges around water. Now again, Jim Carter, I think, did a great job on explaining that, is that we have a fairly well proven and tried system for water management. Is it always been improved and always been worked on? Absolutely. But it has worked well for us. But the bottom line here is industry reduces its use of water, not for altruism, but it is an expense, given the amount of oil production. At 2 million barrels, we'd like to go to 5 million barrels at some point, is handling, moving, heating, using that water is expensive. It uses energy. It takes away from your bottom line. So the industry, very much by market forces, is driven to deal with that. And the government regulations and government management of the system promotes that kind of driving. However, not enough just to improve the recycling rates, to move towards a closed loop entirely. There's an extensive research at the University of Alberta on using no water at all, where the systems go to solvents and other technologies that would provide for that. Certainly a current and a continuing discussion in the industry is the resource intensity issue. The oil sands, in terms of land and tailings, and just to touch base on that briefly, oil sands lie, and just to use a different metric here, just give it perspective, if you look at the footprint of New York City, the oil sands lie under about 3 of those. The Alberta boreal forest itself is 8 times the New York City, 18 times. But the actual mining disturbances, you go down to the city of Seattle, and we're about 3 times. Okay, and in situ, far less. About 80% of the oil sands will be mined by in situ, as opposed to straight mining in open pit mines. The issue with the tailings pond, when it was first developed in the 60s and 70s, and Suncor Syncrude having the tailings, no one's ever done this before. Okay, that's really what the issue was. And so the thought was, you know, in the lab, and you actually do this, and if you're in one of my classes, I bring in some bitumen and we mix it up, and you know, by the end of the class, the nice thing about doing this is it settles down. And you actually have fairly clear water in the space of an hour or 2. But you start going into an industrial level situation, damn, the stuff didn't settle. In fact, it's not going to settle. And so if you look at literature in the history of this, you're going from a period of, well, it might settle in 3 years, and then it was like 10 years, and then it was 15. And then they got up to 200 years, and they realized, hey, we got a problem here. So in the meantime, the oil sands tailings were growing. And that's why you would see Pembina and other ENGOs saying, look, we need to slow it down, get the technology first, and then let's ramp up, is what their argument has been. However, in the meantime, technologies now have and are being perfected and are put in place, and we'll show you a couple pictures here briefly, especially around the TRO technology for reclamation. And Jim talked about that earlier, so I'll just expand on it. Something about that he didn't mention is that it's an incredibly good technology. It's working. It's proven to work. We'll show you the picture here. First of all, just to give you a quick idea on that, because we're going to come back to it, is two of the towers, and just to get a load of the size of those, and if you can just picture where you might be standing in there. Just you can see a doorway on the green building, so you get an idea of the size of these towers. So I want you to keep that in mind as we come to another picture. So the environmental challenges with the tailings, and we'll come back to this other point in a moment, has been the ecosystem impacts with land, with the tailings, with the ducks that landed on them, habitat, our First Nations, the traditional lifestyles and to their health, reclamation issues, as we mentioned, for the oil sands tailings, getting the technology in place that can do that. Suncor turned around and basically gave the technology to their competitors and said, if you want to help cover some of the cost, great, otherwise we'd like you to use it. Okay, we want you to, you know, it works, here it is, we'll give it away to you. And that was important because they understood that the industry needs to move towards more collaboration. And so that's quite an important thing. A small thing for the finance people among us is Canada, we're moving towards the International Financial Reporting System more, and that is going to have some impact on around the mining, because now the liabilities are reported slightly different from what you'll see in the US GAAP or the Canadian GAAP accounting practices. And so my think tank has been doing some studies and publications in preparation for that. A site to go is Osran at the University of Alberta with Chris Powder. Does a lot of work in this area around the tailings. Highly recommend taking a look at that. So if you look in the top or in the middle left side of that, the next picture, now you see the top of those two very, very large stacks. And what you're seeing here is the beginning of the reclamation of bringing in the topsoil into tailings pond 1A. This is the first tailings pond. And they're now beginning that process of reclamation, bringing back into the sand, bringing in the topsoil. So the fun thing for the students and I is that they gave us permission with proper equipment to be able to be some of the first people to walk on a tailings pond and not be fearful for anything. But you can see the height. Now the reason for that is that this thing has been tiered up 7 times over its lifespan. And in doing that, give the size of the immensity of that, and so now this technology has taken this basically and turned it into a massive, huge rock, which they now can put reclamation on top. And I've got a series of pictures as we go along showing this type of thing. So is it possible? Can we do it? Absolutely. The timelines, though, are long. Can they be shortened dramatically? Now that we know the technology, yes. Next 15 years, 10 years, you'll see just 2 operational tailings ponds, and that's it. The rest are going to be reclaimed. Jim talked about the GHG emission challenges with air. And just going back here, sorry about that, is these numbers have already been mentioned, the emission intensity. Interesting thing about the $15 a ton, and just to go on briefly here, here's the next picture in the oil sands tailings, more reclamation taken last year, the work that's been done. It's also a great testing ground for the scientists in reclamation, and they're having a lot of fun with this, in that, for example, Jim mentioned this earlier, they got raptors in quite early in the process, okay, and the feeling and the understanding from our biologists and our scientists, and they learned this from Yellowstone and other work that's been going on in the United States, that this is actually quite important, having the raptors first. For an energy economist, it was a piece of interesting news for me. The thing about looking at our GHG emissions, one of the things that we challenge our government on, in one of the recent COP, about 4 COPs ago, they're like Rocky movies, you lose track of which one. But in the COP meeting, not in Copenhagen, I have to go back a bit, but we kept telling the minister, look, announce a $35 a ton. We can go with that with the oil sands. We've done the research. Following on the work of William Nordhaus out of Yale University, it was mentioned a little earlier here today, is we have expensive emissions. Yes, meaning that we can afford to pay for those emissions because the product that we have is worth something, and that we can do that. And so we've been pushing and encourage industry, let's get on with this. Part of what we've done, though, in that $15 a ton program that Jim mentioned earlier, why that was so important, and when I was working on that, and the driver behind that, was that we now have the ability to manage the system and do it with very, very low transactional costs. And yes, $15 a ton on emission intensity, you know, let's be real, it's just a spit in the bucket. You know, a couple $100 million is not a lot of money that we've had from this. Yes, there's been some reduction in GHG, but it's not serious yet. What is serious, though, is that we've now developed and understand how to do this kind of work. Here, the EPA was quite helpful in sharing a lot of information around the SO2 trading program, the acid rain program. And so that kind of collaboration, again, has been very, very helpful to us. The improving the intensity, as I say, a very important part of the industry. So finally, I'm sure that's enough time here. A little picture sent to me from Suncor showing a 6 years difference, and the point being is that, yeah, we need to be able to prove to the world that we can produce a product that is cleaner, greener, that we're driving that forward, that we would like to see ourselves as world leaders in this project, that we can take unconventional oils, and yeah, the unconventional world is now upon us. We've heard a lot of discussion on that. It involves new technologies, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things, out-of-the-box thinking. Need to keep driving that, and we can have these kinds of results. Thank you very much.
We are running a bit late, but I think, to me, this is an important enough topic to at least ask for 1 or 2 questions if you have them.
I actually have 2 questions, but they're
well, you get both of them then.
No problem. I guess the first one is, with the exception of the last speaker, the 3 previous speakers actually mentioned air quality issues being a greater concern than perhaps water quality issues, and that public perception is a little bit skewed in this regard. And you know, there wasn't really any attention given to why that's the case, or what is being done either by industry or local municipal regulatory agencies in that regard. I'd like for each of you to address that if you have anything to say about it. And the other question was really going to be directed to to Robert, but he had to leave, I guess. But perhaps one of you can address this. He pointed to the study that they're doing with Boston University looking at methane leaks in the city of Boston itself. And what occurred to me is that infrastructure is municipal facilities. And when it comes down to paying for utility infrastructure, revamping utility infrastructure, it's a very different game than what we see, say, for interstate pipelines and compressor stations along interstate pipelines. And with that in mind, what sort of policy recommendations might you think be in the works to address those sorts of issues? Because to me, those are issues that go beyond shale gas production. They're issues that really speak to what happened with the disaster that PG&E experienced, for example, last year. So if you could address those, I'd really appreciate it.
Well, as to why is the public focused more on water than on air, and I think that's right. The public is focused more on water than air. Set of reasons. First, I think is that they've received a lot of bad information. In some cases, not deliberately bad. In other cases, I'll say deliberately bad information. I mean, you have a very powerful movie called Gasland, which I'm in, and you have an iconic now image that is probably the most powerful energy image, if I was have to pick one, with the possible exception of the Macondo well in flames, and that would be tap water in flames. That is such delicious television that it gets played when there's virtually no reason to play it. You know, all kinds of shows run that image, and most people have seen it 5 to 10 times. It's a very striking image. The other, and then you have the main gas reporter for the New York Times, who literally put on the front page that Pennsylvania's water might be contaminated with radionuclides. I mean, by the way, I didn't say this, there's been a massive testing done of Pennsylvania's water in response to that story. There was actually testing done before the story, but there's been a massive amount of testing done, both of tap water and in-stream, and all results have come back at essentially background levels, certainly safe. There is no radionuclide or other problem with public water systems in Pennsylvania or anywhere else, to my knowledge, because of gas drilling. So it's a set of bad information, and you know, I think at this point there's also a failure for within the industry to successfully differentiate between good operations and bad operations. I think that's important, because this industry, like all industries, is not perfect, but it creates the impression by defending or attacking every single claim of a problem that it thinks it must be perfect in order to maintain public confidence. If they were to concede a problem, the impression is left with a lot of people that they are conceding the whole enterprise is fatally flawed. So I think that basic posture has actually caused more suspicion rather than less. If they had come forward and said, yes, there's been a problem or two, put it in the right context, and fixed it, I think we would have had less of a reaction that goes beyond the hardcore folks who want to ban it. As to what was the second question? Infrastructure. I was a public utility commissioner, and you're absolutely right that leaks do cause explosions. We've had one in Philadelphia recently, 2 in the Allentown area. A few people have in fact been killed in those explosions. And it is a question of providing adequate funding through utility rate structures. These are monopolies. There's really no reason not to have adequate funds spent through the rate-making case process. It's a combination of utilities asking for adequate funds, commissions providing it, and then there is an execution issue. I mean, you look at the PG&E issue, I mean, the CEO that was in charge at the time is no longer there because there was some real management and execution issues. So that is important to address simply not with just more money, but also making sure that there's real attention to detail, this real culture of safety. And that's a very tough thing to do. I mean, it's an easy thing to say, but it's actually a very tough, demanding standard to meet, because it's a literally day-by-day standard that has to be met.
Just to reply to your last question first, that's been something I've been thinking about and trying to work on, because it's obviously a key problem. One of the issues, I think, is that in some of these pipeline systems, you might have leak rates up to a couple of %, you know, in these local distribution things. And the problem is one of incentives. If I'm the local in charge of the local utilities and I fix those pipes, who gets the 3% gas? In other words, somebody down upstream gets the benefit from what I fixed, if you see what I mean. So what we have to do is address that so that there is some distribution of the benefits back to the people who are doing the fixing, if you understand what I'm getting at.
I do, but to John's point, so I've always been my understanding of local distribution, particularly to the hands of the utility, you do have rate making that is,
Yeah.
we should be addressing that issue.
They make actually a profit on every capital dollar invested. They get almost a guaranteed rate of return. And these days, well, I don't think it's a lack of money. I think generally speaking, it's an execution issue. I mean, these are big systems.
That's true.
And you get one problem in a big system, you can kill somebody. Why do planes crash? You know?
To answer your first question, I think that in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, local government has been playing a major role in funding emissions testing. The first test actually was funded by the mayor of Dish, which is a very small study, but got some really surprising results, and that kicked TCEQ into action, and it also kicked the city of Fort Worth and some of the larger players into funding some pretty large engineering studies. I think the problem is that the environmentalists have wanted to say there's a huge problem. Industry wants to say that there's no problem, and nobody's looking at a risk-based approach. In other words, the real problems, if you look at it, is certain carcinogens and things that are that have a large impact on young kids, babies, that kind of thing. What we should be doing is going in and finding out where these compressor stations are near to schools or preschools and things like that, and remediating those preferentially. I think John's right. The data that I showed you had 10 compressor stations. 3 of them had some bad values. The rest had essentially 0. So you need to be targeted and you need to be risk-based.
Go ahead.
John, the Dimick situation happened on your watch. And we all know that the company that was drilling along Carter Road has, at least their spokespeople have stood up time and again and said, this doesn't really have much to do with us. This is a exhumed natural gas field where the methane was there all along. DEP became involved in this, in its investigation, and what was it, in your mind at least, that led to the DEP to conclude that in fact the operator might have had something to do with the presence of excess methane and Dimick? Because this single event probably has affected the gas shale industry, maybe more so than anything else aside from that iconic flame that is at the end of Josh Fox's movie.
Yeah, DEP looked at something like 60 water wells in the Dimick area, and did first extensive testing of the gas in each water well. As I think most of you probably know, you can pretty well almost fingerprint the gas, and you can determine whether it's biogenic gas, meaning pre-existing gas, or thermogenic gas, meaning that it traveled likely from another source and wasn't pre-existing. And so that was those test results, and there's some interpretation associated with the test results, but those test results narrowed the 60 down to 18 water wells. So those test results removed 40 cases and as not being caused by gas drilling, but there was essentially what I'll call a strongly positive test result based of the gas itself in the water in 18 properties. Then there was a look at the gas wells themselves, both the design of the gas wells, the pressure readings in the gas wells, things like video evidence, videotapes of bubbling of gas in the gas well cellar. There was also some repair work done on some gas wells and plugging done, and then looking at gas levels following the plugging and gas repairs, and in some cases saw fairly quick reductions, and in other cases reductions but over a longer period of time, and then in about 5 of the 18 didn't see reductions as a result of anything that had been done to remedy the situation. Though unfortunately was no pre-existing water testing in the case of Dimick. The Pennsylvania law does say that in the absence of pre-existing water testing, that there is a presumption that gas drilling caused the pollution if the gas drilling was within 1,000 feet. That presumption applied in some of the cases, not in all of the cases. Without the presumption, there was a very strong basis to conclude that in at least some, but not all, of the water wells looked at, the gas did result from some poor gas wells that were actually evident in the area. I will also say again that since I left, the DEP, my successor, has issued a notice of violation to the same company for another case where there was pre-drilling water testing, and the pre-drill water tests showed no methane prior to the drilling, and now, at least in 1 water well and perhaps in 3, the tests show a considerable amount of methane. I'm not personally familiar with whether testing of the gas in the water has been done to identify it as non-biogenic or thermogenic. But beyond all that, it gets to this issue of what do you do if you're a company or an industry when confronted with a situation like that? What's the smart thing to do? And I would humbly submit what was done there was not the smart thing to do. I think the families now involved in that case, by the way, the DEP did settle with the company itself, and the company agreed to pay $4 million, $4.1 million to 18 families. I think those families now are so enraged that they're not any longer fully rational. Had the company responded differently in January 2009, when the case first started, with an explosion at somebody's water well, I don't think we'd be talking about Dimick. I think none of you would have heard of it. So it's a very, very regrettable situation for everybody involved. Beyond that, I think it's absolutely clear that in a very small number of cases, gas migration as a result of poor drilling has occurred. It didn't happen just with shale gas. We've had gas drilling in Pennsylvania for a long, long time, and we've had some gas migration cases because of poor drilling well before the first shale gas well. But it's a completely different environment now, media, regulatory, and otherwise, with the advent of shale gas.
Well, with that, we'll quit here, and thank you very much, Phil. Very good.
So we've had a very interesting day, and you're a very die-hard audience. We're running a little late, but I do want to take the opportunity to introduce our closing speaker, Thomas Carter, who is the founder of Blackstone Minerals Company, which is a, hold on, I want to describe it properly, which holds fee and royalty interests here in Texas. Mr. Carter is well known among the investment community for his successful pursuit of the right assets at the right time. And we have asked him to speak a little bit about the economic issues associated with the industry and its operations in the United States.
Thanks, Amy. I know we're behind schedule, so I'll be quick here. What I'm going to address briefly is something that Amy and I have been talking about for close to a year now, and it really is in the context of there's some very compelling situations in the context of the unconventional resource phenomenon and a national energy policy, as well as other things. But let me just make some observations here. Let's talk about our economic and political scene. It's not news to anyone that we've just gone through one of the most severe economic slowdowns in the history of the country. There's an expectation for long-term no growth situation in developed countries, while the United States, Europe, and others go through a significant deleveraging process that's going to be painful for a while. If you talk about U.S. fiscal facts and look at it in the sense of an annual economic checkup, it doesn't look so good. 10% unemployment without much improvement. No public capacity for stimulus. We've got $15 trillion in debt. We've got a big annual deficit, which is expected to be around $1.1 trillion in 12 and 1.7 in 13. We've had our first debt downgrade in the history of our government. We see a government that's in total paralysis, can't get much done, very extremes. For example, the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction could not agree on how to take the first step by reducing $1 trillion in cuts or increased revenues over the next 10 years. Let's talk about our domestic energy scene. Several facts. The United States still imports about almost $400 billion a year of energy, and this has been going on for some time and has caused what many people refer to as the largest wealth transfer in the history in modern history, from us and the developed nations to places that you know. The price of imports, we bring 50% of our imports in from OPEC to balance, and the largest single source from Canada, Mexico, Russia, and Colombia are the others. Price of these imports is set in a global market. Supply, that's created primarily by OPEC and others. They have a very strong control of that. The demand side is very much set by, well, the four biggies are China, Europe, India, United States, and others. Well, two of those economies are growing. Ours is not. But the price is set by a growing economy. So we're buying energy at a very expensive price in a time when we can least afford to do so. The emergence of the U.S. unconventional energy resource, especially natural gas, with the right national directive, could very much reduce the energy bill to the U.S. consumer and enhance the job picture and help address our fiscal problems. Arthur Berman made the comment earlier that the industry was destroying capital by spending $20,000 and $30,000 an acre buying leases in wildcat plays. That, in fact, did happen, but that happened in 2008. And I would also mention that at that point in time, natural gas was selling for $14 to $15 an M. It's selling for $2 and change now. And being an owner of interest in 17 million acres in the United States, I can tell you nobody's paying $30,000 an acre for leases today. I wish they were. I think the industry has gotten a serious amount of religion about that, and I could go anecdotally into that, but I won't. But what are some ways that this can be a benefit for our country, especially the natural gas unconventional resource? We said we needed $1.5 trillion at least over the next decade to just begin repairing the national fiscal health. And I think both Republicans and Democrats can agree that more revenues are needed. They can argue on how to spend them, but I don't think they would disagree on the fact that we need them. How much taxes are paid to the U.S. from sovereigns that sell U.S. energy? Basically none. Yet we have enough domestic energy to displace a lot of these imports and buy it from U.S. producers that pay taxes to the U.S. I won't go through the dynamics of it if you want to, and these are numbers that are fairly loosely calculated, and we're trying to refine them further. But if one said that 50% of the domestic consumption, domestic production displaced imports, which would take a lot of work and a lot of time, that would yield approximately $35 billion a year in taxes that we don't get right now. And if you put a multiplier effect of any kind on that with the jobs from the service industry, et cetera, one of the gentlemen earlier mentioned Eureka water purification in Pennsylvania, that is an up and running business now. I'm sure that's creating jobs and revenues and tax income for a lot of people. You put a multiplier effect on that, you may be seeing something in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year in tax income. You put 10 years on that, and that's going a long way towards this $1.5 trillion that Congress was unable to come up with. It's there, we can get it. Let's talk about severance taxes. There are approximately $10 billion a year paid in the United States in severance taxes from energy production. And there's also approximately an equal amount in ad valorem and local property taxes. We all know the strains that exist on state governments meeting their budgets and local governments with education and funding schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we take this import away and displace it with domestic production, you're going to create a substantial amount of state and local tax bases that can be used to help out what we're doing. That's before you even get into the job cycle, but I'll just two quick examples of the job issue around the energy consumption of the United States and the globe. One that's very anecdotal is that North Dakota, I think, has the lowest unemployment rate of any state in the country. It's at 3%, very much driven by the activity that's going on in the Bakken Shale up there. I was riding home the other day and I heard a piece on NPR that is similar but different in a substantial way. It was a discussion about a village in Spain just south of Madrid called Villa de Caras, if I got that right. And this little village was very excited because they're extremely unemployed. You know, Spain is under a lot of economic pressure like a lot of the EU countries are. And the unemployment rate in the town, it was 30% or 40%, something like that. And they got together as a community and found that Spain was not able to pay for exporting spent nuclear fuel rods to France anymore, and they had to figure out something to do with them domestically. Well, this town got together and created a nuclear disposal site that's going to create a tremendous amount of jobs. I don't care whether you're in Pennsylvania, New York, Karnes County, Texas, or Siberia or Nigeria, wherever energy is produced, there are going to be economic ramifications of it. And if it doesn't happen in Bradford County, Pennsylvania, it's probably going to happen in Nigeria. It's going to happen. Let's talk about the cost of energy. Domestically, I'm on several boards of mostly educational institutions and have been through several budget processes in the last couple of months, and almost to an entity, for the first time in a long time, these enterprises are forecasting a reduction in energy cost, which is a big deal for a lot of people in this country, and it's primarily driven by electrical rate reductions, which is also primarily driven by the low cost of natural gas. Of course, natural gas is not totally fungible with oil, but it certainly is in some areas where we're not making the most of that. Let's talk about the BTU cost efficiency of gas. Today, on the NYMEX strip, the prompt month for an MCF of gas was $2.50. We all know the old BTU adage that it's a 6-to-1 ratio. So on those things that are fungible, $2.50 gas at 6-to-1 on a BTU basis is a $15 barrel of oil, as opposed to a $100 barrel of oil. And that's good news and bad news. I also have been in numerous debates and other discussions with companies from Exxon to small independents around development on properties that we are the mineral owner on, and they have leases from us, and drilling natural gas wells at $2.50 is, I don't care, I mean, you can put whatever spin on you want. If you're drilling a 10 BCF well at $14 million cost and getting 250 before BTU adjustments and all that, you're going to have to be a magician to call that economic. However, at $6 an M, the Haynesville, which is the largest field in the country now, is extremely profitable. Well, we have no national energy policy, so we've created a situation, or a situation has created to where we've developed these gas resources to where the price has gone down to $2.50. But we're still spending $400 billion a year buying oil from overseas at $100 a barrel. You don't have to go to Harvard to figure out that that's not very good economics. If it was at $6 an M, and those plays were very economic, that's $36 a barrel on a BTU equivalent. I would say that, once again, the gas plays can be very economic at a much reduced cost per BOE than what we're paying right now. Eagle Ford oil plays are a little bit less. I mean, they start losing profitability when you get below $60 a barrel, and some would say even higher than that, which is still extremely expensive compared to the cost of natural gas, even at a higher rate than we are today. So clearly, reducing energy costs in our country by using natural gas would affect all aspects of U.S. consumer life, long-term and near-term. A good friend of mine has got a lot of, he's on the New York Fed and is involved in a lot of political things, always says, never fail to take advantage of a good crisis. And we sometimes do take advantage of crises. And I'm going to make some analogies here that are sort of out in left field. But I want to get at the concept of what I hear a lot is when we talk about conversion and consumption of gas versus internationally produced oil. You'll hear a lot of things, well, we can't do that, it'll take forever, not going to happen, never going to work. Well, a crisis causes things to happen, and I would argue that we are in a crisis. It's not a crisis like existed when Pearl Harbor got bombed or something like that, but I would say that the long-term socioeconomic effects of what we're doing to our economy, with the lack of energy policy being a small component of that, but a meaningful one nonetheless, means that we are in a crisis. I think if you look back at World War II or something like that and said, you're going to be able to do what in terms of responding to this threat and producing armaments, et cetera, and getting the Manhattan Project going, people would have told you couldn't do it. Well, Amy and I talk about what we need is a Manhattan Project mentality around this energy policy. You know, a question for a national energy policy might be, can we afford as a government, as a people, to environmentally promote fracking and production of natural gas in the state of New York. The other thing would be, should we pursue a policy that's going to cause $200 billion a year of revenues to flow into these U.S. oil and gas companies that are vilified frequently by the national public, and they might make a profit out of it. They might also create some jobs. I would suggest that if you don't produce it in New York or Pennsylvania, then you're going to buy it from Nigeria or Iraq, or you're going to at least support that system. And I think the global environmental footprint is probably worse there than it is where we are, which brings us back to this not in my backyard situation. I think the real question is not the ones I just posed. It's, can we afford on a long-term socioeconomic level not to do these things while we wait for the next generation of energy sources? And this is a topic that is a deep well, but that's the wrap-up of, I think the unconventional gas play has provided us with a tremendous opportunity. The question is, will we have a national will and discipline to capture it?
Well, it's been a very interesting day. I'm sure that none of you have the discipline not to check your electronic device at some point during the day, so I'm sure you're aware that President Obama announced, as we heard from Dr. Dixon, that we are not doing the Keystone Pipeline, or maybe he's announcing that now, and after he's elected he might be forced to change his mind. And so I say how incredible that we're having this conference. One of the guys, people have been tweeting from the media, and somebody actually made a tweet from the media joking that we're having, how incredible timing that we're having this conference on the same day as the announcement. And I did not coordinate with the White House, so definitely a coincidence. But I liked Tommy's quote, that never to fail to make an opportunity out of a good crisis. And I think that sometime in the next year or two, when we look back on this whole debate about Keystone Pipeline, we're going to have a historical perspective, and we're going to realize that we didn't debate the issues properly. So I'm going to give a few takeaways on that topic instead of summing up the conference instead, because we're all going to go home and watch the news and be aggravated probably by the commentating we're going to see on this topic. So we've all been preachy all day, so I'm going to be preachy too. There's a lesson to the oil industry in the story of Keystone XL. And the lesson is, when you ignore the environmental planning of your infrastructure project, you do so at your own risk. Right? We live in a different world today. I remember a few years ago, I participated in the American Petroleum Institute private workshop here in Houston, and it was a very interesting day. It was not on any of these topics. They brought in futurists. They brought in futurists to talk to the oil industry about how to think about, the 20-year view. Great thing. They had Ken and I because they wanted us to talk about, at that time, how natural gas was going to become geopolitical, which at the time nobody believed. Everybody was talking about it was a domestic market issue. And so I talked about that, but I listened to the other futurists, and they had a really interesting guy there who was talking about social media before it was obvious what social media was going to mean. And at the end of the session, everybody had to fill out a form about whether, was this good and bad, and I'm sure everybody said that I was great, right? But because everybody was interested in natural gas. But they thought the idea of listening to this futurist was completely useless and not applicable to the oil industry. And now you can all see, between Twitter and social media and the anarchy movement and young people activism on the subject of the Keystone Pipeline, that thinking about the engineering is not just thinking about the physical engineering, and it's not just thinking about what is the most commercial route. It is also considering the social and environmental impact of a project. And it's my opinion, especially after listening to the sessions today, that one could intelligently make the argument that Canada has a proactive policy on climate change, that they are a country that has been a responsible actor in the climate change global debate. I'm not sure I can say that about the United States. And so I really feel like, have we had a policy debate about oil sands and the emissions and what Canada's plans are and what Alberta's plans are to lower the emission content of that resource, if we've been able to hold the debate on that and not get distracted by a routing that went through a drinking water, an agricultural water aquifer, then it would have been a different level of debate. In my opinion, just as a media commentator, it didn't become a real negative until it became caught in Nebraska politics, which is not to say that it might not have ended up the same way, but I really feel like the general public really does understand that they put fuel in their car, that the Strait of Hormuz is being threatened to be closed. Now, I don't believe that the Iranians have the military ability to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed for some extended period of time at this time. But but when they threatened and tried to close the Strait of Hormuz during the Iraq-Iran war, it wasn't so serious a problem as it is today with the military buildup they've had in the interim period. And it'll be very different when they're a nuclear power. And we have failed to understand and recognize that. No one talks about that in the media, even when the last 3 weeks of coverage on Strait of Hormuz. When we talk about the Arab awakening, we talk about it in sort of a CNN Libya way, like we watched it on the news for 3 weeks and then Gaddafi was gone, and it's as if we imagine in our mind that there is a stable democracy now in Libya and all the oil companies are going back and they're producing the oil, and of course that's not what happened. That's not what's happened. And it might be 1, 2, 3 years before there's a truly functional government in Libya. And I like to tell people in history, and some of you in the audience have heard me talk about this in the past, the first Egyptian revolution in 1952, the turmoil that sent forth in the Middle East lasted from 1952 to 1969, 1970. It did not last from 1952 to 1953. And so when you get up in the morning and you say, the oil from this country or that country from the Middle East has not been cut off by worker strikes or social turmoil in an oil-producing region or conflict, geopolitical conflict over the fate of Syria between more than one country in the Middle East, and you rest assured that you think that this will continue and that we'll be able to get by the next 3 years without a major problem in the Middle East, I mean, that is really an optimistic view. Really optimistic. And if I'm right and that's optimistic, and we do have a problem in the Middle East in the coming years, the idea that here in the United States we do not need the oil from Canada is not going to be a popular decision retrospectively. Now, I don't believe that the Keystone Pipeline, we're going to have to call it something else, right? So my first suggestion to TransCanada is to, whatever they're going to do next, give it a different name. But had they looped their existing line, none of this would ever have happened. Had they bypassed the aquifer because they realized that there are going to be environmental groups that were going to protest that and it might gain political traction in the state of Nebraska, maybe none of this would ever have happened. And, I hope that, cool heads prevail and that the content of this conference is not lost on the public. We have tremendous potential resources in this country, but there are environmental challenges associated with them, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't produce it. If you don't want to produce it, then stop driving an hour to work and stop buying Fiji water and bottled water from New Zealand. And don't eat fruit out of season from Chile. I mean, the bottom line is either we're going to lower our consumption, or we need to come up with a way to both, through regulatory cooperation between the industry and our government, but be it local and federal, and between public interest, we need to come up with a way to tap the resources we have here for so many reasons, for the reasons that Mr. Carter talked about and John Deutsch talked about this morning. You know, this is a national challenge, and it's not teams. And the idea, this what I call the no oil movement. We're gonna block anything that's related to oil. Everybody who is in that movement is driving in a car, and their car runs on oil. And until we get to the point where that is no longer true, it can be an aspiration. We should have policies that set it in motion. I thought the comments from Professor Engelder about it is true. There are many technologies that were launched during the Carter administration that are made fun of now, all of which we're using. They were considered giant white elephants at the time. 5 years ago, everybody said they're white elephants, but we are using those technologies today. And we need to understand the pipeline, which is a 30-year pipeline. And so we need to not abandon clean tech, because we're going to want clean tech in 30 years. We'd like it sooner, but the answer is just because it's 30 years away doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But because we're going to do it doesn't mean we don't have to do something to protect what we're going to use now. And that would be my sum up of the day, right? That we need to have a 1-year policy, a 5-year policy, and a 30-year policy, not just a 30-year policy. We need to know what we're doing this year. And with that, I thank you all for joining us today. This has been a really fantastic session. I thank all the speakers for their time and effort. And I thank all of you for your support of the Institute and our energy program. We look forward to seeing you again at our next events. Just to tell you what we're working on here at the Baker Institute, we are continuing our work on natural gas, and we're doing a large study with Harvard University on the future geopolitics of natural gas. We have also begun, and that study is with support from ConocoPhillips. We've also begun a new study with support from Chevron, looking at the intersection between the oil boom and bust cycle of drilling and prices, which is more timely today with the price of natural gas down to $2.50, and the general business cycle and how the two things interact and what it means for our economy long term. So I thank you for coming today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future at the Institute.